Like many readers and budding writers growing up in the 80s, I was a big fan of Stephen King. He was really inspirational to me, and I blame him for a lot of my late nights staying up reading horror stories, and I also blame him for a lot of my use and misuse of punctuation. Although I found out later that he wasn't really responsible for my misuse. I misinterpreted a lot of what he did. It turns out he is really a great user of punctuation, that a lot of his unique voice in writing comes from his use of punctuation. So a few years ago, I decided to use some of his writing to demonstrate to my students how they can use different items of punctuation to really expand their writing, to use different types of punctuation in different ways. Rather than just use a comma all the time, you can use different types of punctuation, dashes, semicolons, ellipses, use a lot more variety in their writing. So what I'm going to show you is, using Stephen King's writing style, show you how to liven up your punctuation use. Here's a paragraph from a review Stephen King wrote just a few years ago of the last Harry Potter book. This paragraph is from the first part of that review. And so now the hurly-burly's done, the battle's lost and won, the Battle of Hogwarts, that is, and all the secrets are out of the sorting hat. Those who bet Harry Potter would die lost their money. The boy who lived turned out to be exactly that. And if you think that's a spoiler at this late date, you were never much of a Potter fan to begin with. The outrage over the early reviews, Mary Carol McCauley of the Baltimore Sun, Michiko Kakutani of the New York Times, has faded, although the sour taste lingers for many fans. Now let's take a look at that sentence by sentence and see how he uses a variety of punctuation to really bring his voice into the writing. And notice that he uses a lot of different types there. He uses the comma several times, but he also uses semicolons, ellipses, dashes, and parentheses. The first sentence reads, "And so now the hurly-burly's done, the battle's lost and won," the Battle of Hogwarts, that is. Notice how he uses the dash to separate the Battle of Hogwarts, that is, from the rest of the sentence. Now the dash is used to insert information, much the way the parentheses is, but it's also used to insert information in a way that draws attention to it. And notice the Battle of Hogwarts would bring in information that would bring in J.K. Rowling's fans, so somebody that would know of the content of the book would be aware of that, and it would sort of draw them into the writing, to the conversation. So you have to have a dash on either end to make that work in that way. In the next sentence, King uses a semicolon. "Those who bet Harry Potter would die lost their money," semicolon. "The boy who lived turned out to be exactly that." He's using a semicolon right there to connect two sentences or two independent clauses that could be sentences together, and they're closely related, and that's where you can use a semicolon, to connect two independent clauses that could be separate sentences but that are closely related. So instead of using a period there, he uses a semicolon. He could also use a comma plus and, but instead of using commas all the time, you can use a semicolon there. In the next sentence, he uses a comma, but he uses it in a way I think I want to draw your attention to. He begins with a coordinating conjunction. Now that's something that maybe a lot of your high school English teachers told you you shouldn't do. It's not necessarily wrong to begin a sentence with a conjunction. It acts as an introductory phrase. Now when you begin a sentence with an introductory phrase, particularly a long one, you typically end that introductory phrase with a comma. And that's what he does there. In the last sentence, King includes two items of punctuation he hasn't used so far, the parentheses and ellipses. The outrage over the early reviews, Mary Carol McCauley of the Baltimore Sun, Michiko Kakutani of the New York Times, has faded, although the sour taste lingers for many fans. He includes the names of the reviewers from the Baltimore Sun and the New York Times in parentheses to give specifics about those early reviews that were hotly contested. He uses ellipses to show how, even though those early reviews are no longer quite in the minds of fans, they sometimes still come up in discussions over the fact that a lot of spoilers were released in those early reviews, and so they're still there in their thoughts. And that's really what ellipses can be used for. A lot of people are familiar with ellipses being used to indicate that items have been omitted, say in research writing, but ellipses can also be used to indicate that there's a pause or a lapse in thought or reconsideration, and that's what he's using ellipses for right there. So, the next time that you're revising a paper and you realize that you've written a lot of commas, maybe you can think about Stephen King, try to throw in a few different types of punctuation. Semicolons, ellipses, dashes. Don't try too many things in one paragraph. Notice how he only uses each of those different kinds one time in each paragraph. But variety is good. And you can learn a lot more than just how to scare somebody from the Master of Horror.